Okay, our next speaker is Anna Conrick, who's a practicing spatial designer and design educator at Monash University here in Melbourne. She's currently undertaking doctoral research at the Monash Art Design and Architecture Department, entitled Affinities and Atmospheres Using Design to Rethink Set and Setting in Psychedelic Therapies. Anna's work explores spatial setting as a lively and designable encounter. With a design practice background in both architectural design and fabrication, ceramics and lighting, Anna's professional experience frames an ongoing research interest in vibrant matter and material agency, which lends a particularly sensory focus to her work. So her talk today is entitled Bill Richards' Living Room: How are we designing psychedelic clinical spaces? So please welcome Anna.
Thanks for having me. Thanks, Martin, also for that intro. My name's Anna. I'm a practicing spatial designer, as Martin mentioned, and a PhD candidate at Monash University in the Faculty of Art Design and Architecture. And my work is currently to develop design thinking around ideas of set and setting, and to establish design approaches for psychedelic therapy spaces. During the course of my research, I've become particularly interested in the idea of the psychedelic living room, which is the current spatial typology most frequently encountered in psychedelic therapy spaces. And so today I'm going to explore the idea of the living room from a historical, phenomenological, and design thinking perspectives, and ask some questions about its relevance for future clinical practice. The idea that the living room environment is the optimal spatial container for the psychedelic therapeutic experience is one which emerged during the first wave of psychedelic research in the 1950s and the 1960s. And it's been enshrined over the past 2 decades as a benchmark of set and setting affordance when administering psychedelic therapy. I would argue that rather than being the most clinically effective context to trip in, living room-like as a unique spatial typology specific to psychedelic research is a socially and politically agential relic of mid-century American understandings of comfort, and that it's not particularly appropriate, or not necessarily appropriate, for psychedelic therapy practice in the 21st century. If we're able to conceptually decouple experiences of comfort from the experience of the domestic, then this opens space in the dialogue around set and setting to ask new questions about how comfort emerges through spatial experience and creating a space for new voices in the conversation. So firstly, just a little definition of terms. When I talk about spatial design, I think it's important to define what that is, because it's not necessarily a practical term that people come across regularly. Spatial designers are spatial practitioners. We're built environment practitioners, just like architects and like interior designers. And just like architecture and interior design, we think materially. We test ideas by making them in the world. However, an orientation towards the spatial means that first and foremost we're interested in relationships between people and space, which doesn't necessarily have anything to do with the four walls of a building. So this means that spatial designers have a very particular interest in the space of bodily and imaginative experience, and so we're fundamentally people-focused in the way that we think and practice. Designers are collaborators. We work with clients, we work with other designers, we work with professionals from a range of different non-design fields to translate specialist knowledge into material form. In my personal practice, and we've got some images of the work that I do on the screen, I work at multiple scales, from designing singular pieces of custom joinery to commercial scale environments, and the backbone of my practice is collaboration, in the form of skills sharing, in the form of ethnographic doing, which means that I work by being open to affinities, those potent connections that rise up between material and making techniques that are meaningful to clients. So, for example, with wine rack for a shoemaker, working with materials and making techniques that are relevant to the person that I'm making for. or, for example, experiencing ancient bathing rituals as an embodied design strategy for a bathhouse. So I think spatially, I think about materials, I think about experience. And this is the frame through which I first encountered Bill Richards' living room. Bill Richards, who's pictured here on the right, is the senior therapist at with the Johns Hopkins psilocybin research project, which commenced research into the therapeutic potential of psilocybin in 1999. And he was directly responsible for the setup of this particular therapy space. This space, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with, it's already been on the screen a few times today, is directly referred to in the 2008 Human Hallucinogen Research Guidelines for Safety as living room-like, a type of space which has become widely accepted as a set and setting benchmark when administering psychedelic therapy. Living room-like psychedelic therapy spaces are intentionally demedicalized. They are stripped of all of the clinical elements, either removed or concealed in favour of a space that's furnished like someone's living room. Now, what I find particularly interesting about this space is that Bill Richards designed this space after his own home. So choices about the colour of the sofa, the style of the seating, the carpets, the cushions, all reflect his personal taste and ideas around comfort. This space very neatly demonstrates the idea that the spaces that we construct are extensions of our own sensory and imaginative being in the world. And so, of course, far from being neutral, they reflect a very specific worldview. Asking us to think of spaces as political, as active, as agential is what set and setting theory does, of course, and also it's what architecture and spatial design practice does. The challenges of negating the clinical have produced some quite awkward spaces over the past 2 decades of psychedelic research. You see iterations of this living room-like space recreated in research facilities at institutions across the world, each one nested within a context with its own specific set of constraints. These rooms are often fitted with medical equipment, clinical fixtures, and commercial-grade materials. And photos of these spaces, particularly the Imperial College and the Beckley Institute spaces, demonstrate the lengths that the research teams have gone to conceal clinical spatial markers with the use of large freestanding screens and sheets hung to cover equipment. Anthropologist Tassin Noorani likens the experience of walking into the Johns Hopkins living room as stepping through a portal. There's a deep strangeness in the experience of stepping through a doorway in a hospital into a domestic living room. Something uncanny, something experientially incoherent occurs when the language of the space changes so radically from one room to the next. And I think this is a disconnect which requires attention. Some of the questions that have emerged for me through my research are, why are we going to all this effort to distance ourselves from the experience of the clinical? And what experiences are we actually foregrounding when we do this? So a little historical deep dive into the living room. So a critical binary that exists in the contemporary spatial logic of psychedelic therapy setting is that of clinical space versus domestic space. The idea that clinical spaces and domestic spaces exist or are experiential polarities on a comfort spectrum is one that was first established by a very small group of first-wave researchers. And of this group, the work of Betty Eisner, Al Hubbard, Humphrey Osmond, and Timothy Leary are particularly interesting. Very early first-wave research often identified not a domestic environment per se, but the idea of comfort and associated feelings of safety and of trust as positively supportive of the psychedelic experience. But it was these researchers and their compatriots in research who took this concept one critical step further and bound notions of comfort to the idea of the domestic living room. Central to the development of early thinking around set and setting in the psychedelic experience was self-experimentation. Eisner, Hubbard, Osmond, and Leary each had their own psychedelic experiences, often in their own homes, and were able to compare these experiences to those of patients in clinical contexts. They concluded that being at home in an environment where you are comfortable and familiar tends to support positive therapeutic outcomes. These observations then went on to inform the psychedelic therapy spaces that these researchers created, spaces that were essentially forerunners of the now ubiquitous living room-like psychedelic therapy setting. Presumed neutral in contemporary psychedelic research, these spaces in fact foreground the lived experience of a very small group of researchers who were predominantly white, middle-class North American men. It's their experience of the world which has defined what comfort looks and feels like within psychedelic therapy spaces today. So the next few slides contain some examples of the ways in which the direct experience of these particular researchers have informed these spaces of psychedelic therapy today. Starting with the spaces designed by Betty Eisner and Al Hubbard, like the Hollywood Hospital psychedelic therapy room pictured. And these spaces were directly informed by their psychoanalytic interests and practice, remembering that the spaces of psychoanalysis were then and still are today directly informed by Freud's living room. Additionally, both Eisner and Hubbard, and this is something that they communicated about extensively, introduced the use of spatial props, things like music, mirrors, art, Christian religious iconography, books, and meaningful items. And many of these props have subsequently become integrated into the living room-like model and associated therapeutic practice. Humphrey Osmond, who was a colleague of Eisner and Hubbard, was the superintendent of Weyburn Medical Hospital in Saskatchewan, Canada, and he was involved in very early psychotomimetic research with LSD and mescaline. And it was this research by him and others which first established the understanding that clinical environments negatively affect psychedelic experiences. In the mid-1950s, he undertook a really fascinating anthropological design collaboration with architect Kiyo Izumi, which I'll come back to in a little bit more detail later, which involved Izumi taking large doses of LSD and then mingling with patients in the hospital as a way of understanding the spatiosensory experience of psychosis. Notably, instead of speaking directly with patients about their experiences of space or of psychedelics, Osmond brought in a third party to experience the clinical for him. This means that the personal experience of one single person who was definitely having an altered sensory experience, but definitely not experiencing psychosis, became the starting point for a design process that went on to inform thinking about the design of therapeutic and mental health spaces in Canada for a long time to come. Finally, Timothy Leary's research on set and setting, much of which occurred at Millbrook, which is pictured, in upstate New York. Described as a cross between a country club, a madhouse, a research institute, a monastery, and a Fellini movie set, there's no doubt at all that this place and the community that sprung up around it had direct influence on Leary's thinking about the relationship between the spatial and the psychedelic experiences. In fact, this is where the seminal text, The Psychedelic Experience, was penned by himself, Alpert, and Metzner. Leary's famously blurred boundary between professional and personal life saw the incorporation of countercultural preoccupations with Eastern mysticism and ritual into academic set and setting discourse. And as a result, in contemporary living room-like research spaces, you often see the bizarre inclusion of a variety of spiritual and New Age objects, prayer flags, Mayan and Buddhist statues, crystals, a chalice for delivering the drug. In many ways, though, of the four researchers I focused on, Leary's work had the least to do at the time with the living room specifically, and he was generally quite open to the idea that the focus of set and setting consideration should first and foremost be on individual comfort. So at the beginning of this talk, I speculated that if we can decouple our understandings of comfort from ideas of the domestic, then we will be able to open up discourse around set and setting for contemporary psychedelic therapies. This means stepping away from the living room, though not abandoning its lessons, in order to make space for something new. So I start, I guess, with my research by asking, what is comfort? And early research reveals a multitude of different individual definitions: well-fitting clothing, particular foods, softness, warmth, the presence of loved ones. It becomes apparent very quickly, however, that while there is some consensus about certain aspects or qualities of comfort, there's also deep subjectivity involved. Comfort is a subject covered in sociogeographic, anthropological, architectural, and engineering literature, and each field frames comfort slightly differently. A condensed transdisciplinary definition might look something like this. Comfort is a physical sensation that occurs in the body. It is affectively transferred to objects, like the way a particular chair becomes comfortable when it fits your body just right. Comfort is also derived from memories, and it's felt as anticipations, and so it's an imaginative capacity as much as it is a bodily experience. Sarah Ahmed writes beautifully about comfort as a promise of a sinking feeling. I particularly like the way affect theorists like Ahmed approach the idea of comfort as a specific affective resonance that is constantly in flux, circulating through and between bodies and objects. Thinking about comfort as an oscillating, emanating, moldable resonance then changes the question for me in design practice from what is comfort to what has to configure for comfort to emerge. So returning to the work of Kiyosumi, and this is, in my opinion, where his work is really interesting and relevant for future practice. He reflected on comfort during the psychedelic experience and concluded, and I quote, "A comfortable room seemed to have a visual and acoustical rhythm appropriate to its spatial, visual, and tactile qualities." Azumi identified in the mid-1950s not only the need for comfort, but comfort as an atmosphere contingent on a perception of spatial cohesiveness. I would argue that today's living room-like environments are lacking this cohesion because they are dioramas of everyday life. Living rooms feel comfortable precisely because they are lived in, and so comfort is constantly being negotiated and configured through inhabitation. Psychedelic therapy living room-like spaces, on the other hand, are not lived in, so affectations of domesticity read as pastiche. Domestic environments are often comfortable, but the domestic is not the only way to experience comfort. So let's take a quick look at how design thinks about the experience of comfort. Design as a research methodology is a fundamentally speculative practice. It coheres to lived experience by pulling together people, material, and spaces, and works with experience from the inside to propose new ways of imagining and understanding the world. Not only do designers think with materials, but we think about materials as vibrant. And through iterative making and material experimentation, design explores relationships between materials and feeling and helps us think about material and the material and experiential world more openly. It doesn't try to shut down, resolve, finish, and refine. It opens up and it asks questions. Each of these projects pictured is working with the body and material to speculate on new ways of finding comfort, with spaces, furniture, and in the case of Cocky Eek in the bottom right corner, with inflatable clothing. Taking material experimentation a little further still is the practice of artist-designers Arakawa and Ginz. These images are from their reversible destiny lofts in Mitaka, Tokyo, completed in 2005. Navigating these spaces is not easy. The designers have used material to destabilize expectations around perceptions of size, distance, horizon, slope, and time, demanding finer and more varied interaction of the senses. These spaces draw attention to processes of configuring comfort by challenging the body to exist in novel and often quite uncomfortable ways. The result, as reported by the building's inhabitants, and people do live here, is a heightened state of engagement with the world that is quite profound. Now, I'm not arguing that this is what comfort reimagined looks like for psychedelic therapy, but projects like this one are useful because they show how design practice can help us think about the spaces of comfort in a completely new way, and then test these ideas at one-to-one scale. So returning to current psychedelic therapy practice, I'm going to wrap up this presentation by briefly addressing the status quo and proposing some possible future directions for new ways of thinking about set and setting. Living room-like environments have already travelled outside of the container of psychedelic research into the space of therapeutic practice. The passing of Proposition 122 in Colorado last month and Oregon's ballot measures in 2020 have set up mechanisms for legal psilocybin clinics, the foundations of which are already being built by companies delivering ketamine ahead of psilocybin and MDMA. Some of these are pictured here. And all of these practice-oriented therapy spaces borrow from the language of the living room, established by research and often fused with other types of health and wellness spaces like yoga studios. If we look in contrast at the spaces that designers are delivering within the expanded field of health and wellness and drugs, you can get a sense not of what we necessarily should be doing, but of why designers should be part of this conversation. Psychedelic experiences are weird and wild and strange, and psychedelic therapy is such a deeply profound paradigm shift in medicine. We need to be creating new spaces for new experiences. And to do this, we need to engage designers who are specialists, who have a deep understanding of material agency and sensory experience. In order to generate something new, we need to unhitch our understandings of comfort from domestic space, re-examine the notion that clinical environments are wholly antithetical to comfort, and seek an understanding of comfort that reflects a diversity of experience. This is what my research is seeking to do. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks very much, Anna. Okay, any questions coming through? Great question, thanks. So in terms of patient comfort, what consideration is being given to olfactory and auditory considerations? And so, yeah, particularly in reference to a hospital environment, clinical environment, that can be very difficult for people or triggering or whatever. So have you considered that so far?
Yeah, absolutely. Look, I think what we need to see is the development of multi-sensory spatial considerations. I think both sound and smell can be very powerful in terms of triggering all sorts of mnemonic associations. And so I think that a spatial design of a psychedelic therapy space wouldn't be doing its kind of ethical due diligence if it didn't consider the full spectrum of sensory engagement with spaces, both within the psychedelic therapy space specifically, but also within the expanded field of set and setting as well.
Now, have designers been looking at biodesign in designing these spaces, not just biomimicry, but actual use of microorganisms and fungal materials in the room? Excellent question.
That's a great question. Well, I think the short answer initially is that designers really aren't part of this conversation yet. So I haven't yet come across another designer, although I'm sure they exist, who's kind of thinking about these things yet. It's only a matter of time. But I think that that there's this really interesting kind of space for the consideration of vibrant materiality within the design of these particular medicalised spaces. And I think micro-design is like a really huge untapped resource. So I'm keen to see the future of that and keen to be involved in that personally as well.
I guess something as simple as just filling the space with plants and with living organisms is also a good start.
Well, I mean, biophilic design is a particular design orientation that draws from the technologies of the plant world, I guess, and it makes sense to me that that there should be that there are affinities between psychedelic spaces and kind of the broader world of plants. So there's certainly a way to look at it from a biophilic perspective, but then I think taking it one step further and actually working with fungi as a material is a really interesting future direction.
Another excellent question. Doesn't a neutral living room exterior assist a client to go deeper into their own inner terrain rather than manipulating their experience from the outside?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I guess my argument is that the living room isn't neutral, and that actually it reflects a very particular, very specific idea of what's comfortable, and that if we're moving this kind of medical technology into the mainstream, we really need to think about whether that's most appropriate for a really broad diversity of people who will be encountering these spaces. And I think that the living room's good, and there's a reason why it's been used. I mean, it is, as a spatial proxy for comfort, it's quite effective to a point, though, I think. And I guess my sense is that we need to really focus on finding nuance and finding sophistication in the spaces that we're producing for this experience, which means moving past the living room as a setting into something new. But it doesn't necessarily mean abandoning all of the things that the living room can teach us about what we find comfortable. I mean, sofas and lounge chairs are comfortable for a reason because they fit the body in certain ways. And so all of those things, I think, should be brought along for the ride as we develop the kind of spatial technology further.